Non-denominational churches are actually not a bad thing. They're actually a good thing, or at least a microcosm of a good thing. I think that there is some poor stigma and some bad association around non-denominational churches, and that's not without warrant. But I also think that there's a lot of positive and a lot of good. Now, this video is a direct rebuttal to Redeem Zoomer's video on non-denominationalism, and I honestly feel like I don't need to do this because of the amount of people who responded to that video and essentially are making some of the points that I'm going to make here today. But I do feel like it's worthwhile to make a video about the strengths and weaknesses of non-denominationalism in general, because I do think that there are some, and it's worth talking about. And I actually currently attend a non-denominational church, having attended other mainline denominations and other things along the way. I'm not certain that I want to stay in a non-denominational church forever, but I think that they're valid, and I think it's actually valid to choose between a non-denominational church and a mainline church. And the point about that is the point that I want to make today. Just the essence of that argument. So, as I said, this is a direct rebuttal to Redeem Zoomer's videos, which I'll have linked below, and I do want to preface by just saying that I really like Redeem Zoomer. I really like his content. Obviously, we disagree on a number of things. I don't have a Reformed theology, and he's Presbyterian and very Presbyterian strong and very anchored in tradition in a way that I think is maybe too much, perhaps. But I think a lot of his videos are excellent, and I really like his content, and I like enjoying his content, and I have absolutely no problem with him as a person. I just think he's wrong on this specific issue, and I want to talk about it, and I think it would be really beneficial to talk about it. So I guess we could start by saying, like, what is non-denominational really? Because it's a hard thing to define. And people who don't attend non-denominational churches often have this idea of them, this presupposition that is not really true to what we're actually talking about. So when we're thinking non-denominational churches, the first thing that you might think of is like the massive evangelical churches. You might think of now I can't think of any off the top of my head, but like Hillsong and like these large corporate churches that are just raking in the money, that are preaching prosperity gospel, that are doing all these things. And that's not really what your average Joe non-denominational church is, at least not anymore. I think there might have been some essence of that at the start. But what it's become now is that there are these smaller, more engaged non-denominational churches that are making this decision because of their problems with the mainline churches or because their church is dying. They're converting to non-denominational churches. They're modernizing a bit, and they're taking a small church and putting it into that and updating it into that kind of place. And those churches are doing it for totally different reasons, and they're maintaining all the core tenets, and they're maintaining tradition in a lot of ways, and they're maintaining structure, like a very Protestant style of church structure, and they're doing a lot of those things, and they're just not siding with the denomination. And so you have, I've seen several examples of just these non-denominational churches being formed. I think there's harm and I think there's good for sure, but I think a lot of non-denominational churches and a lot of people who are representing non-denominational churches come from that. They're just not interested in the dogma and the doctrine and all of those discussions. And you have people who just want to talk about what they believe, and they just want to worship. And I'll get into some of the problems that can come with that idea, but I think that's really the essence of it. So it's not Big Eva, as Discount Doug Wilson calls it. Like you hear kind of people making fun of the Big Eva, the big evangelical churches, and I actually have a huge problem with them as well. I think it's very problematic. I think most of the large evangelical churches are preaching false things. They're ignoring sin. I think that they're preaching prosperity gospel. I think that they're taking in too much money and using it improperly in many ways. And so I actually think that that's the case. And so there is a problem with it. But I also think there's problems with the mainline denominations, and some of them are similar problems. So to argue that one thing is true of non-denominationals that is not true of some mainline churches is just false. And there's issues on both sides. And I actually think that just like many smaller historical mainline denominational churches, these smaller non-denominational churches that are just trying to get the Bible to people for real are just as valuable. So there's some interesting points there. One of which is this idea of like historical institution, and Redeem Zoomer finds this like incredibly important. Now, institutions are important, but how important is it for a church to have an institution? Like, if your church hasn't founded any institutions, is that like the most important thing? So, and I don't think so. And there's a couple reasons for that. An interesting note to make would be that if you look at these big evangelical churches, you have examples of these churches being capable of starting schools, they're starting organizations, they're starting these ministries, like massive ministries, and yet those are the ones we're critiquing. Those are the ones we're saying that there's a problem with, even though they're at the pinnacle of institutionalizing, and they now have the resources and the money and the following where they can be starting these larger institutions like churches and hospitals. Even they're not really doing that because we already have churches and hospitals in just about every city, so for them to start more would be a tad odd. But Zoomer's point about churches, like you shouldn't join a non-denominational church because then you're not contributing to the resources of a larger church, is a bit silly to me. I don't think it's important how many churches your congregation has started. And if you think I'm misconstruing him, he basically says that in the video, but then in the comments where people are responding, I saw one comment where somebody was like, I really enjoy my non-denominational church. And he's like, how many hospitals did you start? And I don't think that attitude is correct. So that's one of the biggest things I'm critiquing here. Is the foundation of institutions really the measure of a good church? I don't think so. I don't think at all. I mean, the goal of the church is to spread the gospel, and there's a million ways of doing that. And community outreach is certainly one of them. But for some examples of mine, I attend a non-denominational church, which has a fairly large congregation for the small area that I'm in. And I'd estimate that our congregation is in the area of 1,000 people, but probably not more than that, probably less, in fact. And that's people who, I don't know if they attend diligently, it's split up into multiple services, that kind of thing. And it's also just the one I'm attending right now. I'm not saying that this non-denominational church is perfect, but I've had a lot of really good experiences with it. And they haven't started any hospitals, and they haven't started any schools or anything like that. But I'll tell you a few things that they do have, such as ministries to the poor, such as missionary ministries. They have massive missionary ministries. I mean, we're funding missionaries to go abroad into a number of places and to do a number of things. And we are doing these. When I talk about outreach to the poor, I'm talking about people that are literally going weekly and taking food and taking the gospel. And we've got groups, and we've got outreach, and we've got lots of organization, a lot of structure. We have elders, we have deacons, and a whole lot of things that you would see in a typical mainline church. It's not all that different than the mainline church that I grew up in. And so to me, I'm not really seeing what the issue is here. And so like, maybe you're not expecting individual churches to have started a hospital, but you're saying that because that church has no history of starting hospitals, that somehow invalidates it. I just think that that's a faulty argument. I mean, there's no evidence to suggest that that's what makes a good church. I mean, what makes a good church is that people are being introduced to the gospel and spreading the good news. That's really the only credence that needs to be held by a good church, is that they're doing that correctly. They're teaching the Bible. They have a proper view of sin, and they are serving the community. And then they're showing that they're Christian-minded in how they serve the community with the best of their resources. And yeah, to push them into a mainline denomination that doesn't fit with everything that they want to do, there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to force yourself into denominationalism. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say that non-denominational churches are popular now because of the failure of institutions, because these things that the Catholic Church was doing and the things that these mainline denominations are failing. There's a number of examples of this, like where things are just not working the way that they used to. And obviously we know that the majority mainline denominations, he admits this in another video that he did, where he's basically making the point that the typical mainline denominations have failed. They've fallen into disrepair when it comes to their views on morality, and even their historical doctrines are just destroyed. And so what you have now are break-off groups. So it's not even the original mainline church. So sure, your break-off groups retain some of the resources, and maybe you can start some hospitals and stuff with that, but there's a lot of other ways to do good. And the failure of those institutions is what's important. You have failures on both sides. And then just like the Protestants, how Catholics will say that Protestants don't have apostolic succession. Well, they do. We're actually in the same church that was started by Jesus and the apostles. It's actually the same church. It proceeds from Catholicism. It's not a heresy. I mean, obviously some people might view it that way, but we don't believe that that's the case. It's not a heresy. We maintain, and we're looking to dig back into the Word, and we believe every single one of the staple beliefs about Jesus Christ of Nazareth and what he did. And those are the most important things. And in the same way, I would say that Non-denominational churches proceed from the mainline churches, and they also have apostolic succession. Now, if we're going to get into a conversation of resources, if resources, which is a lot of what he pointed out in the video, is your only issue with non-denominationalism, again, I feel like I've refuted that. And if that's going to be what you care about, then obviously, sure, a non-denominational church is not what you're looking for. But at that point, I think you're just getting down to preferences. You're saying that Christians are betraying the oneness of the church by choosing to get involved in a non-denominational church. That's just not true. I actually think that the churches should all be working together. As long as you're not dealing with a church that is really like doing something that's highly damaging, you can, with most other doctrinal disagreements, work together. And I've actually seen examples of this in my community as well. Our church works together with like a local Global Methodist church and a local, I don't remember what it was. There's another denomination. It's one of the mainline denominations, and they're working together to do different ministries or worship, or things like that. They are pooling their resources to put things together, and that's what should be the case. It shouldn't be about your one historical denomination relying on its historical denominational fund pools to found whatever hospitals itself. Like, there's a point, and I made this point in my Christians versus Christians video, which is just that, like, we shouldn't be fighting one another. We should be working together, mainline and non-denominational or not, because really, when you compare the doctrinal statements of my non-denominational church, which are stated on its website, like, it's not like we're just free reign believing whatever we want to believe. Like, it's got a pretty well flushed out doctrinal statement on the website, and you can compare that doctrinal statement to the creeds or whatever else that you want to evaluate of the Presbyterian church or of the Episcopal church or the Anglican church or whatever church you want to evaluate it against. And I think you would find similarities on a lot of the main issues. And of course, it would be very similar to fundamentalism and evangelicism and closer to Southern Baptists, really. And as he makes the point, really non-denominational churches are mostly just Baptist in their doctrines, though because they're non-denominational, they can be substantially different if they want to, but most of them are pretty similar to like Southern Baptist evangelicism, and that's okay, really. I don't think there's much wrong with Southern Baptist evangelicism, as a matter of fact. So I also think it's worth mentioning that like we already know that like institutions and liturgy can kind of be both good and bad, and that people have preferences for one or the other. So another conversation is like that kind of going into modernity. And this is happening in the mainline denominations as well. It's like, is there a problem for us to modernize things? Is it a problem that we switched from hymns to worshiping with guitar music? Is it a problem that we switched from, red pews to chairs in a converted warehouse? He makes the point about them being ugly. I actually don't think that's correct. There definitely is some. And I've seen examples of these like kind of cringy, like we've just turned our empty warehouse into a worship space. But I also know some people who've done that stuff, and they have a real passion for just wanting to worship God. And I think that there's a beauty in all of those things. Now, my non-denominational church was built on a traditional church building. And so there was a traditional Baptist, it was a Baptist church, and it was like brick. And then it was expanded so that we could have a larger sanctuary. And the inside is quite modern. It's got a stage, it's got carpet, it's got like a soft carpet, a large stage, a large worship band. There's some lights in there. There's a big cross up at the center, like all that kind of stuff. And it's pretty modern looking, but it's also very nice looking. It's very welcoming. And we don't do liturgy, but we do share in, obviously, the Lord's Supper and communion. They practice baptism. Obviously, it's not far from Baptist. And so I have always felt that there's just a level of preference there. I don't think that either is right or wrong. I really don't think you need to be participating in very specific liturgy from a Protestant perspective. I do think that more and more people are having preference for tradition, but there's still a very significant amount of people that are flocking to non-denominational churches because they don't prefer that. They don't prefer the liturgy. Myself and my wife have both grown up in churches where we've experienced liturgy and how it can be damaging too. Like, you can see that liturgy can result in people who are just dead in the faith. And non-denominationalism has its problems too. They both have their problems. So in liturgical churches, I think you could see a lot of people who are just dead in faith. They're doing no works. They're doing nothing. They're just going to church on Sunday morning to participate. And you just sit in the pew and you read your thing and you say your hymns and all that. And there's a place for that. And then there's there's the non-denominational churches, which are so cool that even the kids are coming, and the kids might not really believe what's going on, but it's actually cool to be a Christian in a non-denominational church. And I believe that that's a problem. That's actually a real problem, and I don't have an immediate solution to it. In the same way that I don't have an immediate solution to the liturgical problem. I really think that there's problems on both sides, and it's a worthwhile conversation to talk about what you could do to change either of those things. But my point is that neither is necessarily the fault of the other. There's always going to be people who interpret things incorrectly, or who use it for their own gain, or who use things incorrectly, and it's just one of the problems of humanity. And that's that modernity of practice argument sort of invokes the modernity of structure. I agree with Zoomer that there is a ton of value in like Renaissance beautiful church structure. It's beautiful. I think it's beautiful. I think everybody thinks it's beautiful. It's universally beautiful. And I like old-fashioned church designs in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways I do. But in a lot of ways, I also like modern designs. Our church, when you walk into it, is very welcoming, and it doesn't just look like you're walking into a tech startup either. Like I think there's a line. Like, you don't want it to just be a concrete building with some signs. Like, our building is well taken care of. I know the staff who are responsible for it. It's well taken care of. It's comfortable when you walk in. There's people there to greet you. It's very friendly. And then you walk into the congregation center, like the worship center, and you've got comfortable chairs. I'll be the one to say this: chairs are more comfortable than pews. I'm sorry, that's just a fact. It's just a fact. This is a fact of the matter. Chairs are more comfortable than pews. I've heard the argument that pews are there to make you uncomfortable on purpose so that you pay attention, but you know what? Either way. But my point is that I think that both can be beautiful in their own way. I do think that maybe it's more timeless to have, this ancient church architecture is more timeless and more beautiful in some ways, but you're also just objectifying. Like, I think that God can value someone's dedication in artwork and in structure to create these beautiful churches, but he can also value just a non-denominational church who's prioritizing, just getting people into the church, and they maybe got a building on a budget because it used to be a warehouse, and then they're converting it and making it a nice, comfortable, and hospitable space, or whatever it is they're doing. I just think that there's no in between. Like, I don't think that God really has a preference about those kind of things. And if you can point to a verse where you think that God, like, if you can show me a verse in the Bible where you think that God has a preference about what building you worship in and what clothing you wear and that kind of thing, I have yet to see it. And to me, that's one of the biggest points. I just think that it can be both. And I happen to like modern architecture, and I happen to enjoy the comforts of modern interior design. And I don't think that's a problem. I don't think your church it doesn't have to use the exact same images. We've still got some beautiful artwork going on. There's still some beautiful decoration choices. There's a lot of beautiful things that can go into both, in my opinion. Maybe less timeless, but we'll see. We'll see in 100 years, maybe. I don't know. Then you have the church's ability to govern itself. As I mentioned, the church that I'm in and two other non-denominational churches that I've been in essentially maintain like a good old-fashioned, I don't know, kind of like Baptist or like Anabaptist Brethren tradition that's pretty similar to like Presbyterian system, where you just have like elders. I mean, you just have some elders and you have some deacons, and there's a process to like flush them out, and then they sit on a board that oversees the church and picks the pastors and stuff. And there's history even in this non-denominational church that's been around for 20, 30 odd some years as a non-denominational church in their selection and their preferences. And so you have structure. You have a solid structure as well. I mean, you have people who become members, and then from a member you can become a deacon or an elder. And I'm not confident on what the exact practice is, but I know that the people who are elders have been there for a very long time, and so there's obviously some vetting process involved there. And I know about their meetings and the decisions that they make, and it really is structured. It's not like every choice is just made on a whim. Like, there really is structure that doesn't differentiate from what I can see from the mainline denomination that I used to be in. The structure is relatively similar. And I think that sort of weighs into apostolic succession and tradition, which is the argument that I already made, which is that a non-denominational church is still rooted in traditions. Like, your elders might not be trained at a seminary, or your deacons and bishops. I mean, that's already kind of refuted in Protestantism, but then, like, yeah, we don't need these specific positions to go through a specific process to be rooted in tradition, and they don't have to succeed directly from the apostles because they're succeeding from the teaching of the apostles, and they're using these qualifications for elders that come from Paul's writings in the New Testament, and I think that they do a pretty good job of that. So I guess just to summarize, like, I did notice that on this video, a lot of people kind of disliked and disagreed with Redeemed Zoomer. And I just think it happens to be a hot take. I actually think that in Christianity right now, that the non-denominational churches are popular for a reason, and it's not just because random people think they're cool. I don't think that that's actually the case. There's some people, for sure. We've seen examples of that. We have a problem with them. It's one of the things that I've been wrestling with recently. But I actually have met more people who I've found to be true Bible-believing Christians who are interested in tradition, who are interested in knowing their stuff, who have gone to school. Like we have theological leaders with good training who are teaching good, solid teachings that I'm weighing against my own study and against the wisdom of the Holy Spirit and evaluating. And I really think it's the case that a non-denominational church is valid nowadays, and people are going not just because it's cool, but because they feel when they have a conversion experience, whether it's because of the church or not, but they're getting invited to these things and they're experiencing people who actually like God. Like maybe some of those people are hypocritical, but they're getting invited and they're experiencing at least some people, our pastors, our leadership, people that I know for a relatively strong fact are on fire for God, and you can be seen what they're doing for him, and then you can see how that affects people and how they convert and how they then desire to have the same experience. And I think that a lot of good is happening in that way. And personally, it's been a real struggle for me because I've actually, to some extent, like, I'm a person who enjoys that, and I can definitely argue for that, but I would be interested in joining a mainline denomination if I could find any that I really agreed with, and I can't. And I'm having a hard time doing that. I'm having a hard time to find even a mainline denomination that practices exactly what I believe. Now, I mentioned that I'm not Reformed, which is why I'm not just walking into my local Presbyterian church. But even if I was going to go for like the Methodist Church is having so many problems right now. Obviously, the UMC is split now into the Global Methodist Church, and so that's something. It's like, do I want to join the Global Methodist Church? Well, maybe. I don't know. I could come up with a list of different things, but then you have a non-denominational church that doesn't have any of that drama going on right now. It's just completely escaped from that. And I almost prefer the Baptist and the non-denominational evangelical tradition in some ways. I prefer to attend those churches because I find myself meeting more people there that are interested in things in the same way that I am. So, like, I wouldn't be opposed to going to a mainline church, but certainly not because of its financial ability to build hospitals. I think that, and I guess this would be the final point, any Christian should be able to walk into any church, really. If somebody just became a believer or they just got told about Jesus and they want to go to a church, they should be able to walk into just about anyone. And so the real problems that we should be looking at is churches that are teaching doctrines that are untrue, especially in relation to sin, because a lot of people might get some things right about Jesus, but they're focusing on prosperity and they're saying that Jesus loves everyone no matter what they do, and even after you become a Christian you don't have to give up your old sins and your old ways. Then that's a problem, and we need to be identifying those churches. I know that I have those churches in my community, like two. Everybody does, and even some of the mainline denominations are going that way. So you've got churches that are causing these problems. And our goal should be that anybody could go to any Christian church. I genuinely feel that way because I know what I believe. You're really talking about infant Christians, because once you know what you believe, most churches agree with most of that. So like, maybe I have a different eschatological view of the end times than the church that I'm attending, but I can still attend that church. And maybe I have a different view. I feel I could even attend a church with a Reformed theology. I might get a little irritated occasionally when they keep trying to tell me how elect I am, but like, I could attend there and I wouldn't disagree with the main 5 points of their faith. And in so many other ways that's true. For like every denomination, they get the main things right. And then that's the important part. And so, like I said, you shouldn't have to, you never have to, because I don't. I have just never found a church that I agree with absolutely every doctrine or everything that they do, because that's just not realistic. And we live in a human fallen world, and that's just not realistic. So my point is that you should be able to attend any church, and all of these churches should try to be unified. I think mainline churches should be unified with non-denominational churches, as long as they're Bible-believing, Bible-teaching churches. That's what holds us together. I feel like I could be friends with Redeemed Zoomer, even though I disagree with certain things, because I know for a fact that he's, well, I don't know for a fact. I don't know for a fact, but I assume for a fact that he's saved. He seems pretty saved to me. He knows his stuff, and he seems like he knows Jesus Christ. That's the important thing. And as long as we get people who know, I also know that he knows what sin is. He has a pretty good idea of he's not misleading people. And so those are the main points. As long as people get the main points, as long as their churches get the main points, it's a valid church. And it doesn't matter how many resources they have. So if anybody would like to share with me anything that says that supports the resources argument, and I would be happy to hear that. But I don't think participating in a church just because of its resources is the right idea. And I think that that's probably the best place to end this. If you have been, thank you for watching. If you're interested in more content like this, feel free to subscribe and follow along with the channel. I'd also appreciate if you like or comment or just do anything really to interact with the channel. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you in the next one.